So this lecture deals with Chapter 2 of our textbook that deals with the theories of rights and duties. There are four things that I want you to get from this chapter and from this lecture. Number one, you want to be able to distinguish ethical theory centered on the means from ethical theory that's centered on the ends. We'll understand that more today. So understand theories that focus on the means of one's actions. Number two, distinguish specific duties. In other words, consider if there is a universal duty as human beings that should be obeyed or not. We want to also understand Kantian theory, including his formulations of the categorical imperative. We're going to actually look at a couple of different formulations that he had of things that he said people absolutely should do in any circumstance, regardless of the situation. And then finally, we're going to understand the concept of fairness and how both Aristotle and Rawls suggest that we view fairness and how we find fairness. So these are four things that I want you to get from this chapter. There's also some other things that aren't going to be addressed in this lecture, but that are in the chapter, and I will point those out as we go along. So I want to begin by having you kind of consider this case, what I call the intruding murderer. So let's pretend that you have a friend who is running away from someone who wants to kill him. And he comes up to you and he says, "Hey, I'm going to go home and hide because someone's trying to kill me." And they go off and he runs off and he goes home to hide from the murderers. Now the murderers come up to you and say, "Hey, where did your friend go?" And you know that these guys are wanting to kill him, and so the question then is, what do? You know where your friend went. You know your friend went home. That's where he said he was going, to hide so that he didn't get killed by these guys. You also think, well, if I tell these guys, they may go kill my friend. So do you lie and say, "I don't know where he's at," even though you do know? Or do you tell them the truth and say, "Well, actually, yes, he just came by here. He said he was running home to hide from you guys." So what do? Well, on the one hand, someone who's focused on the ends of one's actions would kind of argue, well, you should lie in order to protect your friend because, I know lying's bad, but in this case, the ends justify the means. Well, someone who's focused on the means, meaning one's actions, not the result of one's actions, in other words, not the result or the ends, this person is focused on the means, the actions themselves. So they might say, well, the means don't justify the ends. Lying doesn't justify the fact that you might try to save your friend. In fact, if everyone lied, it would just simply not be sustainable. So therefore, we shouldn't lie. So the question is, where does this come from? So this comes from Kant's concept of morality, which is based on what he called the power of ought. So think about this. So Kant says, you know what, if you wanted to be a professional baseball player like Tim Tebow, who went from football to baseball, well, you ought to learn how to hit the curveball, because if you can't hit a curveball, you're not going to make it too far in professional baseball. So he would say, okay, so if I want to be in baseball, I ought to learn how to hit the curveball. It's almost a requirement. If you wanted to be a lawyer, well, if you want to be a lawyer, then you ought to go to law school. You should go to law school if you want to be a lawyer. You can't be a lawyer without going to law school. Now, both of these are called hypothetical oughts. They are dependent upon something that you want to do. In other words, not everyone wants to be a professional baseball player, and not everyone wants to be a lawyer. Although it seems like everyone wants to be a lawyer since we have so many of them. Anyways, these are hypothetical oughts, meaning what you ought to do is dependent on the end that you desire. But not everyone desires those ends, so therefore it's hypothetical. So Kant wanted to know, are there moral requirements that are categorical, meaning you ought to do X, period. We need to do something regardless of our desires. So those categorical imperatives would be the essence of morality, he would say. So he got to thinking and said, well, what is something that we should all do, that we would all recognize as being good and right, regardless of the circumstance? And how do we find that out? Well, he said, categorically speaking, we should always act, as he would wrote, act only according to the maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So what's he really mean by this? Well, to put this into more simple language, he would say you should do only what you are willing for everyone to do all the time. So you can probably see this is similar to maybe the golden rule, kind of, and do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, but it's not quite the same. What he's saying is we should only do an action that we are willing for everyone else to do. So going back to to apply that to the intruding murderer case, so Kant's basic value is categorical imperative, the first formulation of it. He would say, you should do only that which you are willing to become a universal law, i.e. a universal practice. In other words, you should only do that which you're willing to allow everyone else to do all the time. Well, in this case, if you were to lie, you would be following the rule that it's permissible to lie, and thus you would be saying that it's okay for everyone to lie, which would be self-defeating. Why would it be self-defeating? Because the only reason you lie is to try and give yourself an advantage. But if everyone, everywhere, all the time lied, then everyone would know that everyone else is lying, and therefore the lie wouldn't work. So therefore you wouldn't gain an advantage because everyone just assumes you're lying. And so therefore you wouldn't gain that advantage by lying. And so therefore it's self-defeating. So since lying would be self-defeating, the assumed conclusion is simply that one should not lie. Should not lie to the people trying to chase your friend down. You shouldn't lie to your parents. You shouldn't lie to your professor. Things like that. So regardless of the situation, you just simply shouldn't lie, Kant would argue. So how do we actually apply this kind of basic concept of do only that which you're willing for others to do all the time? Well, first of all, you have to kind of find the agent's maxim. By that I mean, so the person who's making the decision, the moral agent, the moral decision maker, what's their actions and what's their motivation behind it? And then you have to imagine if everyone, without exception, followed that same maxim. And then you decide, are there any problems in following that? And if so, then obviously the maxim shouldn't be followed. If there are no problems, then okay, it's permissible. So therefore, going back to the lying, you would say, well, let's imagine if everyone lied all the time, everywhere. Well, that's a problem, as I already said. It's self-defeating. So therefore, we probably shouldn't lie. Or let's say that your motivation for something is that you want to be thought of as a good person. And so therefore, what you're going to do is you're just going to compliment everybody all the time, regardless of the situation. The motivation behind it is that you're really just trying to be perceived as a good person, whether you are or not. So then now you're thinking, so can someone behave in a way that really isn't true to their character? Well, are there problems with that? Probably, right? And so therefore, and it probably would be, well, if people everywhere all the time behaved in a way that isn't true to his or her character, then you really wouldn't know what type of person you're dealing with, and therefore you couldn't trust someone. So it would kind of erode the sense of trust. Since we're eroding the sense of trust, you shouldn't try to put on a false presence or a false face, if you will. And so therefore, that probably isn't a good maxim. But let's go back to our intruding murderer. Okay? Here's something else that Kant would say, and why you shouldn't lie. And that is this: you're never sure of what's going to happen, and so you should always avoid the known evil. So, your friend said he was going home to hide from the murderers. If you tell the murderers where he's at, you know the actual outcome. You think you might know what the outcome might be, but you're not really sure. You might tell them, yeah, he went home to hide from you guys. They might go to his house to try to kill him, but he might already have been there, dialed 911, and the police are on the way, and the police may intercept the murderers right there at the door. and your friend doesn't get killed, but the people get caught. Or maybe your friend decides not to actually go home because he realizes you're such a good person that you're not going to tell a lie, and so therefore he goes somewhere else. The murderers go to his house, they can't find him, he's safe, you haven't lied, there you have it. You don't know what any of those outcomes are. Of course, one outcome could be they go home, they find him, they kill him. Okay? One thing you do know is that lying, if everyone did it all the time, is self-defeating, therefore you shouldn't practice it. That's a known evil. You'll avoid that known evil. There's something else Kant said we ought to do, and that is we should never treat people as an end in and of themselves. We should treat people as an end in and of themselves, not merely as a means to another end. Simply put, this is a belief that just simply says, don't use people. We shouldn't use people for our own benefit or pleasure or somebody else's benefit or pleasure. So remember, to use someone is to make them do something that they otherwise would not have done on their own. So basically, Kant's theory in summary are these. One, we should only do that which you're willing to become a universal law, his first formulation of the categorical comparative. Two, we should always avoid the known evil when making decisions. And three, we should never treat people merely as a means for another person's end, but should treat them as an end in and of themselves. So our book talks about some other duties that are kind of perennial, fundamental duties that we all have. The book talks a little bit about duties to self and duties to other. I'm not going to go into details here, but it describes that we have a duty to ourselves to develop our own gifts and our talents, and our duty not to harm ourselves. And likewise, we also have some duties that, regardless of the situation, we have to others, that we should avoid wrongdoing, that we should show them respect, promote their welfare, show gratitude, keep our promises, and be fair to others. I'm not going to dwell on those. I want to highlight those so that you can make sure that you read about those in the text. That does a pretty good job of explaining them. But I do want to highlight the last one, being fair. So let's just kind of consider this concept of fairness. So Aristotle says that fairness is treating equals equally and unequals as unequals, or unequally. So fairness doesn't mean that everyone gets the same treatment. It means that rules for treating people must be applied equally. So, for example, assume that you have a student A, and student A works really hard in the class, turns all the assignments in on time. He or she attends every class period, pays attention, takes copious notes. They diligently read every assigned reading and takes notes on those assignments, and then studies his or her notes, and then they therefore perform well in the tests. At the same time, student B only turns in half the assignments. He or she misses several classes. They skim the readings during class instead of reading them fully beforehand. They don't study for the tests. They get poor results on those tests. Should student A and student B get the same grade? Would it be fair to give both of them the same grade? Probably not. They didn't behave the same way in class. They didn't get the same results on those assignments in class, and so therefore the ultimate grade shouldn't be the same. That would not be fair, right? So you have unequals being treated unequally. Right. Or perhaps one could say, well, is it fair for the Oklahoma City Thunder to pay Russell Westbrook $28.5 million, but only pay a bench player $800,000? One would say Russell is worth more to the Thunder and therefore should get paid more than some bench player that hardly gets any time. So fairness doesn't necessarily mean that everyone gets the same treatment. It means that rules for treating people must be applied equally, according to Aristotle. Well, John Rawls talked a little bit about fairness too, and he's like, well, how do we know that we're treating people fairly? How do we find fairness? Well, he says that the principle of justice and fairness can be chosen behind a veil of ignorance. In other words, we should try to imagine a society without knowing what place ours would be within that society. So, for example, you may be the foreman or you may be the assembly line worker. Well, what rules would you set up for treatment of workers would you set up without knowing whether you're the foreman or you're the assembly line worker? You'd set up rules that would be fair to both of them because you could equally be one or the other. Or perhaps maybe social programs. And you're trying to think of what's a fair social program. Well, on the one hand, you might be the person that's homeless on the street, or you may be the wealthy individual whose taxes will be used to for support programs for the homeless person on the street. You don't know which one you'll be, and so Rawls would say the rules that you set up for those social programs would be more fair if you kind of consider I have an equal chance of being the homeless person or the wealthy person that's going to be taxed. Or perhaps you might say, well, what's a fair rule for abortion, as an example? Well, you may be the pregnant mother that doesn't want a baby, or you may equally be the unborn fetus. So what rules would be fair with regards to abortion laws? Rawls would argue we need to set those laws based on the fact that we could equally find ourselves in both positions, either as the unwed mother that may not want the baby or the unborn fetus. So basically, to find what's fair, you have to, as he would say, put yourself behind this veil of ignorance. So there are other things in the text of this chapter 2, that you should also be aware of that I'm not going to discuss on this lecture. It talks about rights. Rights are things that we may do if we wish, and which others are morally obligated to allow us to do. There are certain universal rights. There are rights that should be equal for all and are inalienable, meaning if you are a card-carrying member of the human race, you have those rights regardless of race, color, creed, origin, anything like that. And then we have to recognize that there are certain rights there that meet all these characteristics that are universal, equal, and inalienable. The right to life, the right to liberty, the right to religious expression, and the pursuit of happiness. Those should sound familiar. We find them in the founding documents of the United States. And they come from this concept of these universal, equal, inalienable rights. So be sure to read about those in the text. So chapter 2 deals with the theories of rights and duties, with the theories of Immanuel Kant, with Aristotle's concept of fairness, and with John Rawls' veil of ignorance as the means by which we can perhaps figure out what is actually fair and just.